Biscotti are an Italian cookie which are very popular throughout all the regions of Italy. The term biscotto means a cookie of practically any kind, but specifically biscotti means twice cooked. Bis, B-I-S, means two, or again in Italy, and cotto means cooked. So biscotti would be twice cooked cookies. The ingredients to make biscotti include the following: 1 cup of regular granulated sugar, a cube of either butter or margarine, or a combination of both, 3 eggs. If people have problems with eggs, they can use egg substitutes or a combination of both eggs and egg substitutes. One may also use any kind of nuts, almonds, hazelnuts, walnuts. I usually make my recipes with almonds and hazelnuts because I like the flavor of hazelnuts, or as they're known as filberts. One teaspoon of vanilla extract, I like aniseed in my biscotti and the flavor of anise. So I usually put a tablespoon plus of aniseed in my biscotti recipe, and sometimes I add an anise flavor. Other flavors that can be added are shown here. One is Fra Angelico, which is a hazelnut-based liqueur. A non-alcoholic one is a Torani hazelnut syrup. Another one which gives an anise flavor is either sambuca or anisette. If one is making biscotti with almonds, amaretto can also be used, or almond flavoring extract. Three cups of flour are required, and 1½ teaspoons of baking powder. One may sift the flour and baking powder together, or as I do occasionally, rather than sifting the flour, I simply mix the baking powder in with the flour, and either sifted or unsifted, it seems that the biscotti come out equally well. The key appliance in this is the mixer. I use a KitchenAid mixer, and it's a strong mixer because the dough really it becomes fairly hard. So if you don't have a KitchenAid mixer, you can substitute a regular mixer, and then at the end when you add flour, you may want to finish stirring by hand. So first you start out then with the 1 cup of sugar. You place that in the mixing bowl. Then I prepare my butter by putting it in the microwave and on defrost for maybe 10-20 seconds until it's room temperature soft, or maybe just a speck softer. And I then place the softened cube of butter in with the sugar, and at the same time I use the wrapper, which usually has a little bit of butter on it, to butter the baking sheet, the cooking sheet or the baking sheet. I usually try to break up the butter and mix it in with the sugar just a little bit before I start mixing. So I take the mixing paddle and by hand kind of break the butter up so that it's broken down into several pieces and mixed a little bit with the sugar before I actually put the paddle on the mixer and start the mixing process. Start the mixer on low speed, then increase it a little bit until the butter-sugar combination starts to get creamed. And then I add the eggs one at a time and increase the speed of the mixer just a little bit to start mixing the eggs in the butter. And sometimes the sugar butter mixture sticks to the paddle or the sides of the bowl, so at times I stop and scrape before I add the next egg. Looking for a creamy mixture, and sometimes after I add the third egg, I increase the speed of the mixer and kind of give it a good beating for maybe about a minute before I begin to add the other ingredients. The next ingredient that goes in is the aniseed, and I usually use a tablespoon. Sometimes if I want to have a little more anise flavor, I add a little bit more. But the anise seed really gives a special licorice type flavor. Some people like it, some don't, so you could either include it or omit it. Next comes the vanilla. And then the flavoring. I use maybe about a fourth of a cup or so, maybe a little bit less. It all depends on how strong of a flavor you wish to have in the biscotti. So this is strictly up to the person. And you can use combinations. For example, as I mentioned before, you can use brandy and other things. I usually toast the almonds or the hazelnuts in my countertop toaster oven to kind of crisp them up just a little bit. And then I don't chop them up, I put them in whole. And sometimes I even put a little bit more than a cup in. It all depends on how many almonds or hazelnuts or walnuts you wish in the recipe. And then I gradually add the 3 cups of flour. Now the batter becomes rather stiff towards the end, and as I mentioned, if you don't have a KitchenAid mixer, a regular mixer may not be able to handle the stiffness of the dough. So if you do have that type of a mixer, the best thing to do would be to add the flour until the mixer starts struggling, and then add the remaining flour by hand and stirring it by hand with a wooden spoon until things are mixed up. Now before shaping the biscotti into loaves, it may be helpful if at times the dough is not stiff enough to make into a dough, to refrigerate the dough slightly for maybe 10 or 15 minutes before shaping it, or maybe to add just a little bit more flour. And we'll see when I start shaping the biscotti dough into loaves that you can tell how stiff of a dough it is. Now, there are various ways to make the loaves. For example, the size of the loaf determines the size of the biscotto. I prefer to divide my recipe in 6 parts and make 6 loaves. I've done it with 3, with 4, with 5. So the loaves determine the size of the biscotto. And so you take, in my case, 1/6 approximately of the dough. Now you can remove it from the bowl with a large spoon and taking up about 1/6 at a time. You could weigh the dough and divide it really equally. You could remove the dough from the bowl and place it on the floured board and divide it maybe a little more accurately. And so the division really is strictly optional, up to the person making them. As I said, I pretty much can spoon out 1/6 in the spoon that I use, and then I flour my hands and roll the dough, and then put it in the on the cookie sheet or the pan. The loaf is round. It will be pressed down before inserting the pan in the oven. And the reason I don't press them down yet is that sometimes if I discover that they're a little bit crowded in the pan, then I have the ability to move them around before they're pressed down. And as I said before, that sometimes if the dough is not quite stiff enough, it helps to refrigerate it, or perhaps you may wish to add just a little bit more flour to the recipe. A lot depends on how much liquid flavoring you've added. Now, sometimes the last one comes out to be a little bit smaller than the others, but as you will see, once it starts to bake, they pretty much expand out to approximately the same size. And you have to scrape up every single little bit out of the bowl, because you want to make that last roll the same size as the other ones. The term bis, as I mentioned earlier, means 2. So, for example, in opera performances in Italy, if they want the tenor to sing again, they say bis, bis, bis. And with biscotto, it takes the term biscotto, cooked again, or cooked twice. So the first portion of this sequence involves then flattening the loaves down, so they're rather cross-sectionally rather than round, they're rectangular. And you preheat an oven to 350 degrees. And the cooking time is approximately 30 minutes. So as I said, 350, and you place the biscotti in the center of the oven, and time is approximately 30 minutes. Now, if this is the first time that you're going to make the biscotti, I would check the time to see if 30 minutes gives you the proper amount of browning that's required. At the end of 30 minutes, the biscotti have expanded. They're almost touching each other, and they're lightly browned, and you can see the rough edges which give the outline of the nuts. Removed from the oven, and I've usually like to cool the loaves a little bit before going to the next sequence, that is slicing of the loaves. And so I leave them on the pan, or I take them out of the pan and put them on wire cooling racks, which speeds up the process a little bit. So I remove them from the pan with a spatula, and at times they may break in half, like this, that one, and so it's no problem. If you wish to avoid that, you can scrape them loose and lift them out by hand. And I usually let them cool for maybe about 10 to 15 minutes before I slice them. So the time really is not that critical. The slicing process takes place with a serrated knife and a wooden cutting board or plastic cutting board. And so you place the loaf on the board, and then you cut or slice diagonally. Now the first cut removes a little corner, and the little corners I usually cut and save and don't bother cooking twice. Now the angular cut gives it each biscotto a little sharp corner, and in some parts of Italy that particular shape refers to a corner or a sharp corner or small corner, and they call that a cantuccio. So for example, in the Tuscany region there are biscotti which are called cantucci, or cantucci di Firenze, meaning of Florence, and they're similar to this, a little bit smaller in size, and they're made with almonds and almond flavoring. So I slice the loaves, and then I place the biscotti sliced side up on a special wire rack that I purchased specifically for this purpose from Sonoma Williams, which fits exactly my oven. It's like an oven rack. Prior to this, I tried several methods. The one method that most Italians use is that they will take the biscotti and they will place them exactly the way I have them on the rack, except they will put them on the cookie sheet or baking pan and put them back in the oven, and then they will cook them the second time that way, sometimes turning them over, sometimes not turning them over. So it depends on the type of equipment that you have. I find that by cooking them on the wire rack, as I do, that the heat can come to the top and bottom equally, and it cooks them again, or crisps them up quickly and evenly. The recipe that I have makes about between 60 and 70 biscotti. The width of the individual biscotto can be governed by the biscotti maker. In other words, if you prefer biscotti that are ½ inch wide, then you'll get more. If you cut them about the width that I have here, which is maybe slightly over 3/4 of an inch in width. And you will get about, as I mentioned, 60 or 70. I get about maybe between 10 and 12 per individual loaf. When I first started making this recipe, I made 3 loaves, so that you can imagine then the biscotti would be almost twice as long as they are now. And for snack purposes, I think the smaller biscotto is easier to handle, especially if you serve biscotti as a dessert. It's better to put them in small size on a plate. That way people can grab the small individual ones rather than the large long one. Biscotti are sold in coffee houses. Typically they are stored in large jars, and they may be 6 to 8 inches in length. And I think they do that primarily to facilitate the dunking of the biscotto. Now the second baking is done at 325 degrees, and it's for a short period of time. The period of time will vary depending on your oven, so I've calculated mine to be about 13 minutes, which gives me the results that I want. So at the end of the second baking time, that is the 13 minutes, if you check the results, and if the biscotti are beginning to brown slightly around the edges, then that's the time to remove them from the oven. These are the little contucci, or the ends, which have been left on the cutting board, and those are used just as snacks, and because they remain crisp, you don't need to bake the ends like this twice. Now if you want biscotti that are a little bit harder, then you can cook them at lower temperature even longer, maybe 15-20 minutes. But it depends on the degree of hardness that you want. I prefer mine to be a little bit on the softer side, so that it doesn't it's not difficult to eat. If you make them really hard, like hardtack, it sometimes is difficult to chew. So the biscotti now appear to be done, and you can see the slight brown edges and the beautiful hazelnuts. And you allow these to cool, and then you can store them in an airtight jar or plastic bags, and they keep for several weeks without any major problems. I keep mine in this type of a jar, and if you make them small, like I have, it's easier to store in jars because they will roll in the jar and kind of settle in the bottom in different layers, so that I put them in, and then I gradually fill the rest of the jar, and one recipe fills pretty much about a gallon jar. I usually leave the biscotti jar on the counter, so that if people visit us, they can see the biscotti and taste them. Biscotti can be served with a variety of beverages, and because of the shape, they're easy to dunk. So one can dunk them in coffee or different types of wines. For example, white wine or a sweet wine like sherry, port. And they're a very easy recipe to make, and very tasty. The ingredients are simple, and the process is relatively simple. plate of biscotti, glass of wine, e buon appetito.